Welp, I literally couldn't escape Steven Universe no matter where I was on the internet, so here we are. In case you weren't familiar, the general gist of Steven Universe is that there are three superpowered aliens, Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl, that call themselves the Crystal Gems, sentient stones that take on humanoid forms and protect the world from monsters. Their former leader, Rose Quartz, fell in love with a human named Greg, and together they had a half-human, half-gem child named Steven. However, in order for him to be born, Rose had to give up her physical form, essentially killing herself so that Steven could exist. The show follows the Crystal Gems as they try to take care of Steven and teach him what it means to be a gem and to control his powers that he inherited from his mother, while balancing his desires as a simple human child. The show starts off really lighthearted, a charming mix of action and emotion as Steven learns more about himself and his place within the Gems, but a more complex storyline slowly begins to take shape as the series progresses. In a lot of ways, the underlying storyline elements of Steven Universe reminds me a lot of Gurren Lagann, with one's emotional state being linked to how powerful you can become, and our central character being physically weakest and harboring self-doubt, but slowly but surely coming to believe in his ability, and constantly growing physically stronger and emotionally stronger as the series continues. Bit of an interesting story, I had actually checked out a couple episodes of Steven Universe back when it first started airing in 2013, and a little bit again in 2014, but it didn't do much for me at the time. So coming back to check it out again, I'd expected sitting down to give it a second chance would require powering through the first few episodes with a grimace until the plot that everyone was excited about started to kick in. But surprisingly, the episodes that I wasn't a fan of just watching it casually before, I enjoyed immensely when given context within the overarching story. I know a lot of people defending Steven Universe, or just singing its praises, say that it gets really good near the end or about halfway through, but I don't think that's really true. The tone just changes. Right from the get-go, Steven Universe is fantastically written and has top-notch characterization. It's just imperative that you watch the series in order to truly appreciate what it's doing. Visually, Steven Universe is a bit of a mixed bag for me. The style is very simple, at times delving into mild abstraction, especially with environmental effects like fire and fog being made up of simple geometric shapes, and the characters are animated in a rather rudimentary style, and often moving slightly off-model. The visuals work, though it's a far cry from something like, say, Gravity Falls. However, things suddenly get markedly better once we hit episode 20, with characters being much more consistent visually, as well as there being a lot more energy to their keyframes. The style is still simple, but its execution gets markedly better. I'd look up why, but I'm lazy, so I'll just take it and be happy. Similar to the animation is the soundtrack, a mostly mellow mix of simple synths and chiptunes that work well with the light-hearted, happy tone of the initial episodes. About halfway through the season, Steven Universe introduces character songs out of nowhere as well, and it's actually in the very same episode that the animation improves no less, making that entire affair an odd experience. But regardless, the songs themselves are pretty nice, and I particularly like the newest song from one of the latest episodes. Anyone who's watched the series already surely knows what I'm talking about. But maybe it's just because I've been spoiled by people like Daniel Ingram, but the songs in Steven Universe to me lacked a bit for me to really get into them. They're like the auditory equivalent of the animation. Serviceable, respectable, but nothing mind-blowing. That being said, I'm glad for their inclusion. The only real thing I'm not a fan of from a technical perspective is the runtime. Steven Universe is a half-hour-long block on Cartoon Network, but it's broken up into two 15-minute episodes. This arrangement was fine in the beginning of the show when the stories it was telling were simple and rather non-connected, but now that it's knee-deep in a rather involved storyline, a lot of the later episodes feel like they either end too soon or are moving a bit too fast at times. One would think that the obvious solution here would be to make the more plot-centric episodes take up the entire half-hour block, but it seems like that's impossible due to syndication purposes, as CN regularly will air a new 15-minute episode, then a rerun right after it. I'd really like to see this addressed at some point in the future, but I'm not holding my breath. Steven Universe's biggest strength to me is its characterization. All of the Crystal Gems are dynamic, fleshed out personalities that feel really genuine and believable. Garnet is the cool, reserved leader, sometimes a bit too reserved for her own good. Amethyst is the blunt, rough and tumble girl who do whatever she wants regardless of consequence. And Pearl is the prim and proper intellectual with a mild case of OCD. Part of the pleasure of this show is how these personality types interact with each other, always to hilarious and oftentimes heartfelt results. Steven's father Greg is also a prominent character, and while one could initially write him off as a bumbling incompetent present solely for comedic relief, and lesser shows would have relegated him as such, one quickly realizes though what a genuine person he is, always trying to put his best foot forward and be the best father he can be for his son. He's just a normal guy, marching to the beat of his own drum, who got caught up in the fantastic situation, and is doing what he can to keep up, and respecting the gems enough to get out of the way when he knows he'd be a liability. It's easy to see why Rose would fall for him despite initial appearances. The supporting cast is just as great, particularly Lars and Sadie, who get a fair amount of screen time, a couple dedicated episodes, and are currently in the middle of their own little character arc. Of course, arguably the most important character is Steven himself, and he certainly doesn't disappoint. What's great about Steven as a character is that despite his respect for the gems, he isn't a fighter like they are. Despite that though, it's oftentimes his non-violent ideas that are the most effective in solving the gems' problems. And while this is a great theme, the most cynical viewers could write this off as a naive mentality of a child. But Steven Universe dodges this gracefully with the ever-present mentioning of Rose, Steven's mother, who was arguably even more of a pacifist than Steven is, yet was both revered by her allies and feared by her adversaries. It's not difficult to infer that she was one of the most powerful gems of her time, and yet her weapon wasn't a weapon at all. It was a shield. The whole concept of non-violence and pacifism is a crazy resonant theme that despite its omnipresence is never truly thrust in your face. You just feel it in the interactions with all the characters. It's very subtle. And that's really the best thing about this show. Steven Universe is a master at cultivating emotion as you watch it. From entire episodes down to simple second-long interactions between members of the cast, the concept of feeling is so fundamental to everything this series is about, and it never misses an opportunity to pass that on to its audience. From obvious things like the entirety of the episodes such as Straight to Video and On the Run, to the simple unstated fact that Greg has such affection for Steven, and unconditionally so, despite the fact that he's the reason that Rose is gone. You cannot help but become completely stricken by the emotional connection this show all but forces upon you for the cast and their story. In fact, you can sum up the entirety of Steven Universe with one word: love. Garnet, Amethyst, Pearl, and Greg all love Steven, and the trio of gems actually really act like a motherly figure to him throughout the entire series, which is fantastic in and of its own right, because we don't have very many strong mother characters in fiction just in general. You don't see it very often. To see three really strong female characters also acting in a maternal role is fantastic. You can tell these characters really love Steven. And in turn, in response to this love from his mothers and father, Steven shows love to everyone he interacts with as a result. The character of Steven, and thus the show itself, is a vessel to communicate that love is a powerful force that can bring about the most potent results, even if its strength, or the vessel it comes from, doesn't fit our presupposed idea of what strength is. Rose Quartz knew this, and now, even subconsciously, Steven knows it, and together, they try and pass that on to the viewer. Steven Universe is a fantastic show that really is all about cultivating emotion and making you feel good. It tells a great story, has fantastic characters, and they all work really well together in a natural, very familial, warm kind of way. If you haven't checked out the show yet, like I hadn't, I highly recommend you do it. It's definitely not something in the same vein as Gravity Falls, which is more intellectual and mysterious and kind of makes you think. Steven Universe tries to do one thing and does it really well. It wants you to feel.